opportunity, Richard. There we go. Thank you for the opportunity of being here and to be able to just share my story. And I'm just like all of you, nothing special about my background or my history, but God has done a wonderful work in my life and that of my family. And today I'd like to just share some of that with you. I think the most difficult thing about doing a talk like this is firstly when you're given 6 weeks to prepare. It's really cruel. You know, how do you summarize 30 or 40 years of God's goodness and grace and mercy and pruning in your life down to 30 minutes? And over the last 6 weeks, I've really toyed and struggled with how do I put it in a concise enough way to be able to get across the glory of God in everything that's happened in my life and in my family's life. And I just pray today that God puts the right thoughts in my mind and the right words in my mouth, that I'm able to get across to you the glory of God in everything that has happened in my life and my family's life to date. And it's been a most amazing journey and continues to be an amazing journey for myself and my family. And I really lost the... So yeah, my wife Ellie and I and my son James, we farm. We've got a little farm out on the Petrostrum Road in Tweedy, around 9 k's on the dirt road. Most beautiful piece of land. You see it. I don't know why I keep losing the picture. It's falling asleep. I hope no one else does. Yeah, so we're on a 34-hectare farm. It's really a piece of paradise, and we're grateful to God every day for finding that farm for us. And I say God found it for us because for 2 years while I was working in corporate, I was desperate to find a farm. And I actually put in an offer on 4 different farms over that 2-year period. And it was a time when farms weren't selling, but not one of the farms actually came through for us for a variety of reasons. In one instance, we were actually going to the farm to go and sign the papers. The estate agent was waiting. And as we were driving up the Carkloof Road, I saw something shining in the trees. And I parked the car on the side of the road, climbed over the fence, and there was a whole informal community living on the farm that no one ever bothered to tell us about. And I realize in hindsight, and much of my story is about looking in the rearview mirror and seeing God in so many ways in everything that happened to us. And today we really believe that God wasn't ready for us to move to a farm at that point in time. And it wasn't ready for that farm. And when we did eventually find a farm, it's just the absolutely perfect farm that you could want to be on. We're completely surrounded by the Umgeni River. So 2 kilometers of the farm is on the Umgeni River. We actually sit in the oxbow of the river. You can see that tree line. That's actually the river going around. The only exposed part is probably 150 meters to a neighbor. The rest is on the river. So it's a really beautiful little farm. We've got a herd of Brangus beef. We have a processing dairy. We bottle and package milk. And then we've got a couple of vegetable tunnels. If any of you have been to the Upper Millstone Bakery in Hilton, all their milk comes from us. They take about 700 liters of milk a week from us. But for any of you who know anything about farming, you'll know that on 34 hectares of land, it is really difficult to be commercially viable. Yet we are. And that's completely by the grace of God. And I'd like to just share you the background to us getting to that farm and what we do on that farm so that you can see it for yourselves. How many of you remember Y2K? Do you remember Y2K? Planes were going to fall out the sky. Banks were going to shut down. ATMs weren't going to work. I was really surprised when I looked at it. Look at that Time magazine front cover, the end of the world. And there's a person holding a cross up in the air, and you know there was a lot of fear-mongering going on, and corporates spent an extraordinary amount of money trying to correct their IT systems at that time because everybody believed that things were just going to come to a complete standstill. Well, none of it actually materialized, but for me, Y2K was the most significant year in my life. And I'll explain the reason to you now. Y2K was also the first time as a man that I recall ever crying. And I probably will today again too, because I grew up in a family where we lived on the mines. My dad worked underground for 35 years. It was quite a tough environment. My folks were not by any means wealthy. I think my dad had a standard 6 certificate, my mom had a standard 8. So we didn't grow up in an environment where there were a lot of means. But it was a tough environment, and in those days, men and boys do not cry. And I think as men, we often need to be more vulnerable. You know, we set example for our kids, both our daughters and our sons, and often we think it must be a manly example that we set. Well, it must be a godly example that we set. And sometimes being vulnerable and being open to our emotions is something that as men we struggle with. With us growing up on the mines, you were on the mines and you would then go off to the army at the age of 17 in those days when there was national service, and you'd come back and you'd go and work on the mine, and we all did that. And I worked underground for 3 years after 2 years in the national service, and it was a real male macho environment underground, and it wasn't easy. And one day my brother and I decided that's it, we're going to change our lives. And we packed our car and we both resigned from the mine and we moved down to Durban. And again, in the rearview mirror, I realized that all these things that I was doing in my life were God preparing me for His ultimate purpose for me and His plan in my life. And I call it God's perfect plan because when I look back, my wife and I often say, there is no way that everything that's happened to us in our lives is fate or luck or chance. There's just too much that has happened in our lives to put it down to that. And we just see God in so many ways. And we've really been privileged to go through everything that we have to experience that grace of God and God's plan. Just read that verse with me, Psalm 139, 13 to 16. You made all the delicate inner parts of my body, and you knit me together in my mother's womb. Thank you for making me so wonderfully complex. Your workmanship is marvelous. How well I know it. You watched me as I was being formed in utter seclusion, as I was woven together in the dark of the womb. You saw me before I was born. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. Every day of my life was recorded in your book. Every moment was laid out before a single day had passed. You know, so often I read the Bible, and I think I'm not the only one, and you really like a verse, and you underline it, and you highlight it, but when you read that verse, and you really believe it, honestly believe it, that God would actually take you as an individual and have preordained and planned your life from when you were in your mother's womb. That is such a difficult concept to actually fully believe. You know, scientists estimate that the adult human being contains around 37 trillion human cells. Each one of those cells contains 23 sets of chromosomes. My son was born in the year 2000, James. And he was born with trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome, which means in every single one of his cells, he's got an extra number 21 chromosome. And I didn't have a clue what that meant. You know, at the time, we had a daughter who was 2 years old. My wife was 27. I was, I think, 32. And we were bulletproof, you know, and we knew everything that was going on. I was working in corporate. We already had one child, so we had read the manual, and we knew the manual, and we understood it, and we thought, oh, well, the second child's now coming along. This is really easy. You know, we know what to do. And she got her blood test back early in the pregnancy, and they said there was a high probability of something not being right. And you know, you hear these things, and you don't actually think it's going to happen to you because it always happens to someone else. And we went and saw a specialist. You know, this is 24 years ago now. And the guy actually said to us after he did all his tests, you got more chance of having a car accident on the way home today than your child having Down syndrome. Good thing we didn't have a car accident. But as soon as James came out the womb, I immediately knew that he had Down syndrome. And I had no exposure. I think when we were kids, there was a program on TV where they were in Afrikaans, and there was a young boy in it that had Down syndrome. That's the only time I'd ever had exposure to anybody with Down syndrome. So we really knew very little about it. But God had already been working on us prior to that. So we really went into the birth of James without even thinking about the fact that he'd have Down syndrome. We really didn't expect it to happen. And we had the reassurance from the specialist to that effect as well. Amazingly, Ellie and I were both baptized 2 weeks before James was born. And to this day, I believe that the Holy Spirit was working in us at that time. And we needed that strength, and we needed that presence of God in our lives to be able to manage and deal with what we were going to be dealing with. Always remember my dad, the day that we got the test to say that James had Down syndrome, my dad was diagnosed with stomach cancer, and he died 3 weeks after James was born. But I remember him saying to me before he died, he just said, I'm so sorry your life's going to be so hard. And how I wish he was here today to see that it was anything but hard. That everything that happened to us, it was like a complete turning point in our lives. It changed our future in every way you can possibly imagine, in a positive way. And I really wish, and I hope one day I'll be able to tell him all about it, or that he's sitting somewhere and able to see for himself. So just as an aside, my dad wasn't a Christian, so we didn't grow up in a Christian home. My mom was a strong Christian. And again, it just, as men sitting here today, I realize the importance of our children having a Christian father as a role model. Because so often in families where you only have the mother who's a strong Christian, as a young boy and as a young man, you don't always have the right role model. You don't fully have that experience that you can draw on to see how your dad reacted in different situations. My funniest story about my dad in church is he never ever set foot in church. But I clearly remember my mom bringing the pastor home one day to see him, and we had a 6-foot-high wall in the back garden, and my dad literally ran out the back of the house and jumped over the 6-foot-high wall and ran away, which now as an adult I think about it, I think that's really, really silly. But that's my memory of my dad and church. So I just want to take you through, and again, so much has happened, but I'd like to take you through 3 phases of our family's experience over the last 24 years and God's plan in that. In Proverbs 3 verse 5 it says, trust in the Lord with all your heart and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways submit to him and he will make your path straight. I think the significant thing for me in that verse is God says he'll make your path straight if you lean on him. But it doesn't mean there aren't ups and downs in that road. So it's not always easy. But without a doubt, if you lean on God and not on your own understanding, then God will guide you. Having a child with a significant disability is a bit like planning a holiday to Europe. And you get all the guidebooks and you decide all the cathedrals you're going to go and see and all the museums you're going to go and visit. And you're all excited about it, and you've got your currency right, and the airplane lands, and they say, welcome to Japan. And you've got a choice at that point, because it's completely different to everything you've experienced. It's a whole new set of facts that you have to learn, and you've got a choice to either be positive about the experience or to be negative. And it's very easy to pull into yourself and to say, woe is me. Our prayer for James at that time, and I clearly remember it because when he was couple of months old at our church in Durban. They had a healing, they called people up who wanted healing. And Ellie and I remember us being on our knees in the front of the church. And I looked up and our pastor was crying. And we were in tears because we were mourning in many ways. We were mourning the perfect child that we didn't have, but we were also asking God just to give us grace. And the prayer that our pastor prayed that day for James, I thought it became the mantra for us throughout those early years with James. And he prayed that, not that James would be healed, he prayed that James would be able to reach his own full potential, whatever that is. And that has been the banner in our lives since then, in that everything that we do in relation to James and disability, that God would give us the grace and the wisdom and the means to be able to help him and other folk like him to reach whatever their full potential is. We started seeing things differently. We started viewing the world differently once James came along. And we started noticing that wisdom doesn't come necessarily with education. And wisdom doesn't necessarily come with financial means. And I always remember just after James was born, I got a really bad throat and mouth infection. And I went and saw a doctor in Mshlonga, and he said to me, "Oh, yes, I've heard about you people. You had that kid with Down syndrome." I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you think you're being clever, but I can tell you now you'll probably end up getting divorced as a result. You should have had an abortion right in the beginning." Yeah. And again, people like that negative sentiment, that's what the devil wants in our lives. He wants us to see the downside of the situation that we're in. We then decided at some point that we wanted to set up a trust fund already for James, because we were starting to now think about what a different future it was for us having a child that would be dependent on us for the rest of his life. So we went and saw some lawyers about a trust fund, and the first thing the guy said to me was, "So how long do these people live for?" And yet, over the years when James was small, and since then, we have found the most amazing wisdom in a car guard. And we've found the most amazing wisdom in a teller in a shopping center. And you again realize that we are so stereotypical sometimes in our view of people. And yet, God is just there. You've got to look for God, not in the places that we put people on pedestals, but in every single person, So we became immersed. We became immersed in disability, in finding out more, in learning and getting involved in charities, in raising funds. And those early years, all about us as a family adapting to the fact that we had a child with a disability. And it's quite difficult because society is not geared for it. So to find a preschool that's prepared to take your child is really difficult. To find a school is even harder. And God put the most amazing people in our path. And much of our story and the things that have happened in our lives have really come about as a result of people that God put in our lives. And I think that's one thing I've learned over the years, is that God's provision isn't necessary in the form of a bank account. It's not about how much money can you earn to be able to do God's work. It's about being able to see people in a different way, and the way in which God gives you resources in ways that you could never imagine possible. We started seeing people differently as well. For example, if we went and stood with a can at the Hyperama by the sea to raise money for Down Syndrome Association, and you just look at people coming past, and I was like that too. And you're rushing in on that Saturday morning to get the shopping done. You've got the kids in tow, and you're going as fast. Most of the people who stop and put money in the tin are people who themselves have had a difficult time in their lives. people who don't have the means necessarily. And you think about how lives are just rushing by with these folk, with their families, and they just need to slow down and see things differently. I say there neither is the man without the woman, nor the woman without the man. I've been so blessed to have the wife that I have. I remember as a young man actually praying to God to just give me someone who would love me for whoever I am. And my wife and I have been married for 28 years now. And amazingly, and people say this isn't always a good thing, but we've never ever had a fight in 28 years. So I believe that God's perfect plan in our lives around James and our own lives was to give us a partner that in every sense is a partner. And my wife's an amazing woman. From day one when James was born, within 3 hours of him being born, she insisted that we were leaving the hospital. She wanted to get her baby home. And it was difficult for her as well, because all the challenges that come with it. There was speech therapy, there was occupational therapy. In the first 2 years, we were in and out of hospital on a weekly basis. You had a lot of chest infections, had very low muscle tone, a lot of pneumonia. And my wife just soldiered through it. She would find growth charts particular to kids with Down syndrome, and she'd go sit with the pediatrician, and she'd say, no, we can't measure him on your traditional thinking. We've got to measure him against what a child with Down syndrome should be measured against. And she became totally immersed in James. I labeled that God's plans exceed our expectations. And so when we said, please, Lord, help James reach whatever his own full potential is, we didn't at that time realize that full potential would translate into impacting the lives of literally thousands and thousands of other people. And it has. Jeremiah 29:11 says, for I know the plans I have for you, declares the Lord, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. Our prayer at that time was that God would just grant us favor. And by this stage, we were pretty settled as a family. We had our third child come along, Joshua. The ages of our kids, I've got a daughter who's now 26. James, that I'm talking about, is 24, our second child. And then our third child, Josh, is 20 years old. So there was a bit of a gap after James just for us to settle things down. But our prayer was just that God would grant us favor with people, that God would open doors for us, that He would show us His purpose in our lives. As with you, constantly searching for what is that purpose, what does God want us to do? And by then you're getting into the rhythm of, a family with jobs and schooling and sport and everything that goes with that. We started seeing God open doors for us. So when James was ready to go to school, we were living up in Joburg, and we had decided we were going to move back to Durban. And the corporate that I was working for is a listed company, and we literally decided on a Friday that we wanted our kids to grow up in Durban, where we had studied. And we drove down to Durban on the Friday, found a house on the Sunday. Monday, I went to the office, spoke to the CEO of our group, said I'd like to be based in Durban, and he said yes straight away. And, it's just little things like that God's favor for us was in place. We then had to try and find a school for James to go to, and the other two kids was easy. You just enroll them. James was a different story. And I always remember us phoning Atherton Primary in Durban, and they had never, ever had a child with any disability in the school before. As a matter of fact, we found out afterwards that the principal's wife was involved in some organization where they'd had a really bad experience with allowing a kid with a disability into the school. And we phoned the secretary and we said, look, we'd like to enroll our son. And they said, no, that's absolutely fine. And then we said, look, there is one challenge, that he has Down syndrome. And she said, okay, just hold on, I'll just go and check with the principal. And they came back on the line and said, no, we'd love to have him in the school. And we said, oh, do you need to do an assessment? They said, no, not at all, we don't need an assessment. He's welcome anytime. And you know, the devil loves to try and put obstacles in our path, because I remember the head of the remedial program at that school, her comment was, he should be with his own kind. He shouldn't be here. Yet God had another plan, and there was a teacher there that was a long-serving teacher. She was like the matriarch in the school in many ways. And she just had a heart for James. And she immediately put up her hand and said, I'll have him in my class. And got to the point where teachers would actually compete with each other to say whose class would he be in the next year. And God was so good. And we started seeing how God started working in our lives through James, just in terms of interacting with people, and how much James was starting to teach us about life. And it would be little things like we'd go on a Friday night to get takeaways, and James would say to us, can't we buy for the car guard as well? You know? And he would go and hug the car guard. And you'd realize that he's just seeing people differently. And so he started teaching us to see people differently. And it changed all of us. I know for a fact that in corporate, and I worked in corporate for 23 odd years, my final position was as a global exec, where I ran a portfolio of companies across the world. But I don't believe I would have had the career that I had if James hadn't given me a different outlook. Because without a doubt, it gave me a confidence in many ways, because I respected people for their positions and their knowledge, but I didn't bow down to them at all. And I just think it found me favor in many ways in my career. And I just had a different outlook. I wasn't desperate for promotion or for wealth. And yet God just kept assisting me and giving me favor with people in the corporate world. And in the end, he gave us means through that to be able to do his work. So James started changing us all. Corporate life was difficult. I traveled a lot. I commuted 3, sometimes 4 days a week. There was a time when Ellie and I used to have breakfast dates at the airport in Johannesburg as we were crossing over with each other. We always made sure one of us was at home with the kids, and our kids still came first in our lives, but it was a busy time. And I remember I was constantly asking God, you know, where am I going with this? What do you want me to do? What is the actual plan? And the lesson that I learned through all of that was that in God's time, things will unfold in the way that He wants them to unfold. And it became a really important time for us. My wife, Ellie, was a stay-at-home mom, looking after James and Jess and Josh. And she had stopped studying when James was born. And so she was a typical good stay-at-home mom. And one day the CEO of our group phoned me and he said to me, Tim, I'm at a conference in Cape Town, and there's this rabbi speaking, Professor Feuerstein. And he's talking about cognitive modifiability, and you've got to hear this guy speak, because he's talking about teaching children who have disabilities in different ways. And he has a center in Israel called the International Center for the Enhancement of Learning Potential. But you've got to meet this guy. And to understand this guy that was the CEO of our group, he was a very worldly guy. But God had placed our family on his heart. And through all the years that I worked there, this guy just loved my family. And I know that was God working in him, because he was a real robust, tough, profit-driven guy who liked to go out drinking, and yet he had this real soft spot for our family. So he phones me and he says, you got to meet this guy. I've set up a meeting with him, fly up to Joburg, bring Ellie and James. The guy wants to do an assessment on James. So we fly up to Joburg, and this Prof. Feuerstein says, you've got to come to Israel and to the center. So And again, this is how God has worked, opening doors. And so the company that I'm working for, the CEO, says, oh, did you guys see the guy? Yes, no. What does he say? He wants us to come to Israel. Okay, well, we want to sponsor Ali to go to Israel. So the group sponsors Ali and James and his facilitator at the time, because he had a facilitator that went to school with him, to go to Israel for 6 weeks. To go and attend the center. But like any good corporate man, he says, we're sponsoring Ali on one condition. When she comes back, she has to start a center, and she can use all the resources of our group. Big listed company, 4 billion rand turnover a year. She can use all the resources of our company. She must establish a center like the one in Israel. So Ali goes over, she comes back. And at the time, I was the managing director of all the training businesses in the group. So we had these wonderful facilities of classrooms and lecture rooms. And so we set up a little center called ICANN in Durban. And we hired a speech therapist and an occupational therapist and a remedial teacher. And the group sponsored it effectively. And we got our first 8 kids, and we implemented this Feuerstein methodology. And it's basically about block therapy rather than seeing individual therapists. You all come together as a team, and they decide what's the best course of action to actually develop the kid. Ali did that for 2 years. And then one day, my colleague and I and Ali were sitting and we were saying, you know, it's one thing that we've set up now to help these kids when they're small. What's going to happen when they turn 18? Or where are they going to work? And so we said, well, you know, there's this new thing, broad-based black economic empowerment, and with it, there's skills development, and with that, there are points to companies that sponsor youngsters with disabilities to go on vocational training programs. So anyway, we went and we proposed to our group company. We said, listen, we think there's a need in the market. Can we extend the scope of what we're doing at ICANN and maybe just try out doing some vocational training for some youngsters with disabilities? And I said, yeah, that's fine. We'll sponsor the first 20, but please don't make it any bigger. Just do the 20 and see how it goes. And so like 3 months later, I went to them and said, look, we've enrolled 100 youngsters. Is that okay? And they said, look, that's fine, but please, don't go over 150. 3 years later, we had 750 youngsters on vocational training programs. Ali had 150 permanent staff members. She was a finalist in the Business Woman of the Year award. And she had 6 centers around the country, just doing vocational training. Sponsored by corporates like SA Breweries, Nestle, Ilovo Sugar, you name them, all the big corporates were sponsoring. And that was God, you know, and God's unlimited resources. And that's, you know, it's very hard in 40 minutes to give you all the stories that have happened. But that's how it continued for us. And God just continued to open doors and open our eyes. And if He hadn't given us James, I can't even imagine how different our lives would be. I'm jumping ahead a bit now, but the school that we started way back when James was 12 years old. Oh, I didn't actually say about that. But so when James turned 12, we realized that mainstream schooling just wasn't working for him anymore. Even though we had a facilitator there with him, he was more out of the classroom than in the classroom because the work started getting a bit more complex. And we went to the principal and we said, look, we're going to take him out to school. And the principal said, what? You can take him out to school, but what will you do? We said, no, we're going to start a school. And at that time, we were at Umhlanga Baptist Church, And our pastor was wanting to move out of the manse into his own place. And we said to him, well, listen, can we use the manse as a school? And today that school has 40 kids in it. It's been running now for the past 12 years. It's got 35 staff members for the 40 kids. And again, just, God's grace and the resources that he's provided to Kanyisa over the years, just amazing. We ended up handing the school over when we moved to the Midlands to the occupational therapist that we had hired way back in the beginning. And her and her team still run that school today. John 15:18 says, the vine and the branches, I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so it will be even more fruitful. That road that we say isn't always flat. God, throughout this last 24 years, has continuously pruned us. Our prayer at this phase of our life has always been about sustainability, that God would give us the wisdom and the resources and put the right people in our path for everything that we do to be sustainable. When James was 2 years old, we started a non-profit organization called Employability Vulindlela, and 22 years later, that non-profit is still running. And every year we choose 4 or 5 projects, mostly based in impoverished communities, and we then go out and we write proposals on the 5 projects, and we go out and we find funding for them. And this year we've got an early childhood development center in Mpopomeni that we've been assisting with resources. And last week, Friday, we opened the first therapy center for kids with disabilities in Mpopomeni. And all of that we've got sponsorship from corporates to do. So there's now funded speech and occupational therapy every week for kids in Mpopomeni. We've opened an early childhood development center in an informal settlement in Lidgeton. And Siv's been there to remove bees before. And recently, we were able to add on to that school. There's now 26 kids in that school, and we just built a community hall. And every Friday, they now have youth, and there's 30 youngsters from the community attending youth there on a Friday night. We work with the children's home in Pietermaritzburg, and then the various feeding schemes that we're involved in. And that's employability. And again, 22 years after we started, we'd never have believed that it would become the future of what we were actually doing, and a way just for God to plow into that field and to be able to impact on so many kids' lives with the grace of God. That business that we started with the young adults, the group that I was working for, when we always said when James turned 18, we wanted to live and do something that would allow him to work every day. And we decided on farming. So I spoke to you a little bit earlier about the farm, and I'm a first-generation farmer, but I knew nothing about farming 7 years ago. But we decided that we wanted to be on a farm when he turned 18. So when he turned 18, I resigned from the corporate life, and they actually asked to buy Ellie's business from her at that time. And again, it was God saying, it's time to move on to the next chapter. And I really struggled to resign because it's all I knew. And, we were going out into the unknown. And again, our timing versus God's timing is just amazing, how he just opens the door at the right time. And so they said that they wanted to buy Ellie's business. And I remember there was a change of leadership in the group around that time. And the new guys that came in actually questioned how the group could have helped set up a company and then were paying for the company. and they were quite skeptical of what had happened. And the new CEO was quite outspoken about it. And a year later, in the annual financial statements after we had left, one of their highlighted comments in what they put out to the market was what a successful business ICANN was, you know. So from being skeptical of the reason behind it, it became a flagship in the group for them to brag about. When we left corporate, we said to them, they can buy the business, but we want to be able to establish the equivalent of that here in the Midlands and establish an agricultural academy. And they gave us permission to do that. So not only did they pay us for the business, but they also allowed us to use all the IP to establish an agricultural training school here in the Midlands. And so on the farm at the moment, we run an agricultural academy for young people with disabilities. We only have 3 permanent staff members on the farm, but every day we have around 25 people that work on the farm. We've got a little academy in Maryvale, and we have 190 young people fully sponsored by corporates. All their training is sponsored, as well as a monthly stipend of 5,000 rand to get them to and from classes. And we do either plant production or animal production or food processing or commercial cleaning. And we then do the practical on the farm or on various host sites. So at the moment we have 20 people at the Gourmet Greek, and we have another 10 people at Sunfield Home. And they do the theory in the academy, and then they come to the farm or to the host sites for the practical. And again, God has just blessed that little business so wonderfully. And our goal is always break even, and He always provides for us. Now that I look back, I can't believe we actually made the decision to come to the farm, because I didn't even know what it costs to do farming. And we've never actually done a proper budget in all the years that we've been running the farm and the academy, and yet every year we always manage to get by. And every year we break even. And every year God just puts resources in our way. I run the farming side, and I run employabilities projects. And Ali runs the academy. All the youngsters in there have been to special needs schools. None of them, or very few of them, would have had an opportunity to do any sort of vocational training. Employment is really difficult for that group of youngsters because they don't have a formal schooling certificate. They just get a level when they finish. And so to be able to give them, some of them stay with us for up to 3 years, vocational training, it's just wonderful how God has opened that door. Between the ICANN Academy and our academy, to date, we've put around 8,500 youngsters through those vocational training programs. And many of the corporates that actually sponsor them employ them in a permanent capacity. If not, then we try and help them set up their own little micro businesses in their community. So God is just amazing. You know, God's pruning of us, it comes in different ways. So we established if I had known dairy farming was so difficult, I would never have started dairy farming in the first place. But anyway, when we were still in Schlonga, some young guys approached us, agricultural students, and they said they heard that we had this farm in the Midlands, and could they help us start up a dairy? So we bought 55 head of Jersey cows and Holsteins, and we started a dairy. And it was really hard work. But before we knew it, we were doing 6,000 liters of milk a week. We started our own processing plant. And again, God put amazing people in front of us. I was at a flea market one day promoting our milk here in Carkloof. And an elderly gentleman came up to me and he said, he's a processing engineer. And he happened to have a son in a wheelchair. And he knew what we were doing, and he asked, can he come and give his input into the dairy? So he came and he trained us on how to do dairy processing, meet all the standards, and Ray would come every Monday with a little white coat and a clipboard, and he would teach us everything that we needed to know about dairy processing. And yeah, before we knew it, we had 3 trucks running, and we were going all the way to Salt Rock, and we were doing 6,500 liters in bottles, glass bottles of milk. And we started actually having a business, which in dairy, which was not what God had intended. You know, God had intended for us to create an environment for people with disabilities to come and get work experience. And our natural instinct was to grow the business, you know, and it started becoming more about the milk business than about the training of people with disabilities business. And I remember one week, and David will know this because we used to give milk to the church, and then we suddenly stopped. It started with coffee shops phoning me and saying, listen, we don't know why your milk's not off, but it's not frothing. I said, where? And we started asking around about it, and it turns out there's an enzyme in the feed that under certain conditions will cause the milk not to froth. So that became a bit of a challenge. And then we started questioning, should we be doing dairy on the scale that we're doing it? And then the next week, our cows went from producing 16 to 20 liters of milk a day to producing 8 to 10 liters of milk a day with no explanation. And I realized then, we sat down and we said, hold on a second, you know, is it not that God is telling us that we've lost focus of what we should be doing? And that same day, we then sent a message out to all of our clients, and we scaled the dairy right down to doing 1,000 liters, and we refocused ourselves on training of people with disabilities rather than building a milk business. And God has continuously pruned us like that. So whenever you think you're getting ahead of yourself, something comes along that just sets you right again. God also has a great sense of humor, because at the time of deciding that we were going to stop doing the dairy, we thought, well, we're going to go with beef, and we're going to do a Brangus stud. And so a friend of ours said, oh, he knows a farmer who's got both a Brangus stud as well as a dairy, and he's looking to increase the size of the herd. So we were sitting down, and he would come and look at doing a swap with us of taking all our dairy cows and doing a switch with the Brangus. And we sat down and we said, okay, well, if we're going to do a stud, let's give it a name. And I immediately said, let's call it 21 Up. And they said, why 21 Up? I said, no, well, James is trisomy 21, and we always see him as the upside of Down syndrome, so let's call it 21 Up, and we'll always have that as a reference point. A week later, the guy came back and he said, listen, I've looked at your animals, and I'm prepared to give you 21 Brangus cows as a direct swap for your dairy cows. And we thought that was so prophetic what had happened. And it's genuine, and it's a true story, and just amazing how God works. In terms of family impact, you know, God didn't just impact Ellie and I. My daughter Jess is a speech therapist working with profoundly disabled young kids. And God just gave her a passion. And the poor girl, from the day she was 2 years old and James came along, she was dragged along to all these disability events, and she was continuously bombarded with disability. And yet it could have made her negative. It could have made her resentful. And yet it gave her a complete passion and compassion for youngsters with disabilities. My son Josh, he grew up having to be the older brother for his Down syndrome older brother, who was 4 years older than him and weighed 3 times what he weighed. And what it did for him is it just gave him a resilience and a maturity and an ability to stand up for himself. And he's currently a second-year law student, and we just see how that experience for him has given him a strength, and we'll see him in good stead. And if you talk to him about what he wants to do one day, he talks about law clinics and helping people who can't help themselves. So again, God didn't just bless Ellie and I with James. And someone said to me the other day, gee, James is so lucky to have you as parents. And we said, we're just so lucky to have James, because our whole life is different as a result. So God's plans are sustainable. You know, if I look at the last 24 years, in our own strength, we could never have had the opportunities that we've had. We could never have impacted the number of lives. And I always was I was continuously looking for my purpose. And I can tell you stories right back from when I was a youngster. I was continuously asking God, what is it that you want for me? And amazingly, in the last year or two, I've realized that my purpose is to be James's dad. That's what God wanted for me. And when we were going through the Bible in church a little while ago, and we were talking about Moses and Aaron, and I almost feel like I'm the Aaron to Moses. And I remember in that story when Moses said to God, listen, I'm not a good speaker, I can't speak for myself. And God got quite upset with him and said, paraphrasingly, listen, am I not the one who made people to see and the mouths to speak? And yet God still gave him Aaron. And many times I feel like my job is to enable. And that's what God's purpose for my life is. I spend every day with James. He's my best friend. He can drive me nuts sometimes because he can talk the hind leg off a donkey. And he's completely man and he's completely child. He'll do anything for a packet of knickknacks. But he asks for a beer on a Tuesday night when we braai every Tuesday. And he wants to talk about hunting, and we hunt bears, and we grow big beards, and we have these crazy conversations about he wants a helicopter for his birthday, and I've got to fetch him, and he must hang on the ladder of the helicopter, and I must fly. So it's like really grounding for me to be around him. But he's got this amazing ability to pick up on your mood and to pick up, he'll say to me, do you have a headache? And then I better start smiling, because but the first and only time I've ever actually believed that God spoke directly to me. And we all as Christians, we want to feel like, where's the booming voice telling us to do something? Is a couple of weeks ago, I was driving in the car with James, and I was really irritable. I'd been to the licensing department, and you know what that's like. And I think a car turned in front of me somewhere, and he could tell I was irritated. And if you've spoken to James, he has very little speech. You've got to really listen nicely for what he's saying. Most of the time, I understand what he's saying because it's in context. So I'm with him, so I know when he says a word, I pick up and okay, that's what he's talking about. But as clear as any of us would speak, he said to me, Dad, don't think with your mind, think with your heart, and God will bless you. It was one of the most profound things I've heard him say. And you know what he did? The whole day he kept looking at me going, like just to reinforce with me, but how he came up with that, and it's just been such an absolute privilege the last 24 years, and I'm so grateful to God that he gave us James, and I'm so grateful that God chose us as the parents. And the benefit of being able to have experienced God in so many ways in our life, just the absolute grace of God and the provision of God, has just been so wonderful. 2 Corinthians says, but he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Therefore, I'll boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses, so that Christ's power may rest on me, And so often we see the disability rather than the ability of the people around us. David gave a message, I think 2 weeks ago, speaking about prayer and that family that had prayed with the child with a disability. And as a result, the church had a whole program running for disability. And the flip side of that is that every single one of those people on the program have the ability to impact the lives of thousands of other people if we just see them differently and we just look for God in them, But it's been a wonderful journey, and I hope I've been able to impart a little bit of that. There's so much more to it, but God is good, and God's grace in our lives is amazing. His resources are unlimited. when it's God's plan, it's sustainable. When it's our plan, it's limited. I just pray that for each of you, that purpose is probably right in front of you. You know, sometimes the thing that we're looking most for is right in front of us, and it's not some big ticket item. It's something really practical and basic, and we have got the chance to really experience God in our lives. Thank you.